I flew here this morning. I find air travel quite conducive to negative thinking. That happens if you're as tall as I am and you fly economy. But the melancholy thought occurred to me as I was on the plane that my career has to a large extent tracked the decline of traditional Western written culture quite closely. This wasn't by intention. In 1989 I joined a magazine called The Independent Monthly, and soon after that the traditional weekly and monthly news magazine started to collapse as a species. So I jumped ship to publishing, which proceeded to enter its death throes. And I then went to work for a newspaper. And they're not looking too healthy either. A friend who's a merchant banker says that once newspapers collapse, I might be able to hire myself out as a sort of negative advisor for financial investment. Any industry in which I take the slightest interest should be abandoned immediately. We're here today to celebrate Western civilization, and I'd just like to spend a few minutes praising one of its pillars, or what I think is one of its pillars, although it's not always as widely acknowledged as others, and that's property rights. This is of particular interest to me, given the sort of career I've had, because intellectual property rights in the form of copyright law have been fairly crucial to the success of newspapers for a long time. But this is largely breaking down on the internet, which is an interesting problem. Of course, it's interesting to journalists, but I think it's got a wider interest too, because so far, at least, newspapers have tended to be fairly crucial to the health of parliamentary democracy because they inform and they sometimes challenge. And a lot of people working in newspapers now and others are quite pessimistic about their future, which raises the question of what might happen to the health of our democracy in their absence. And indeed, if that was a problem, what might happen to the health of Western civilization? So that explains the somewhat overheated nature of the title given to this talk. And I do work for newspapers. I can see that I'm potentially biased. A US internet guru called Clay Shirky once said that institutions and those who work in them will always try to preserve the problem to which they're the solution. So I hope I don't end up doing that. But let's start by celebrating the importance of property rights to Western civilization. They, of course, have many benefits. One is that they provide the individual with a certain independence from the state. I remember the early communists used to say that they would like to divide up property, but of course the gangsters who came to run real communist states didn't do much dividing up. They grabbed it all for the state because they realised that any amount of private property in private hands would be a threat to their own authority. Another great thing about property rights is you need the rule of law to preserve them, and it encourages wealthy and powerful people who have property to support the rule of law, which can then be extended into other areas. Now, property rights they've been important throughout Western civilization. They were important in the ancient world, but they really jumped ahead in Britain in the centuries before the Industrial Revolution. It would be reckless probably to try to disentangle the exact nature of the relationship between private property rights and the economic growth of recent centuries, but I think we could probably assert that we could not have had one without the other. Of course, they spread to many other countries, and there's a close correlation between their presence and prosperity, even democracy. And of course, the opposite applies, as you can see in many Aboriginal communities. The Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto has built his considerable reputation on arguing that the introduction of property rights could be the most important single thing that could be done to promote economic growth in many third world countries. It's even been argued that by giving property rights to Peruvian farmers, at De Soto's suggestion, Peru actually destroyed the rural basis of the Shining Path revolutionary movement because it gave those farmers obviously a stake in something else. Dr. Johnson once said that there are few ways in which a man can be more innocently employed than in making money, and of course acquiring and improving and using property is one of the most important ways of making money. I assume the distinguished audience here knows who Dr. Johnson is. Not long after I joined a major Sydney newspaper, I filed a column in which I quoted Dr. Johnson, and a few hours later I had a call from an anguished sub-editor saying he wanted to check the accuracy of the source and could I provide the good doctor's Christian name and his phone number. And that's a true story. I think property rights are so much a part of our civilization that we can tend to overlook them. There's an American journalist named Tom Bethel who's written a pretty good book about this called The Noblest Triumph, and he says this is understandable, but it can also be a problem in situations where property rights come under threat. and few people realise what's going on. And I'll just talk about that in a moment in this context of the breakdown of copyright on the internet. But we do see it elsewhere. We saw it in Australia about 18 months ago when a farmer named Peter Spencer lost his farm because new laws protecting native vegetation had stopped him working it. He's the fellow who went up that wind pole for about, I think it was 50 days, in what turned out to be an ineffectual protest. These laws had effectively deprived him of his most important rights to that property, and I was struck at the time by how few Australians really had an understanding of what was happening. The media tended to frame it as an environmental issue, not a property rights issue, even though his farm had in effect been stolen from him by these laws. And most people seemed to accept that. They didn't seem, I discovered in many conversations, to have much of a sense of property rights. Although I suspect if the government had moved in on their own front gardens, they might have acquired that sense more quickly. Since the Industrial Revolution, the rise of universal schooling, all sorts of intellectual property rights have become important, possibly more so today even than before because of the importance of knowledge and information in the economy. Now, of course, intellectual property rights are different from physical ones. As Tom Bethel points out, the issue of scarcity comes in here. With physical property, there's often simply not enough for everyone who wants some to have some, so that's a justification for property rights. But with an idea or a form of words or a picture, a patent, you can, in theory, have as many versions as you like. So this raises the question, why do we have intellectual property rights, things such as copyrights and patents at all? And the answer seems to be to encourage people to create things such as newspapers and films, machines, medicines, all those things that people want and will be prepared to pay for. You can argue about the form that intellectual property rights might take, how restrictive they ought to be, but in some form or another I think that they are essential to the intellectual vigour of our civilisation. And part of this is the importance that copyright has traditionally been for the media. Not always. There have, of course, been periods, particularly in early Australia, when the media would just grab the London papers, as we heard earlier this morning from John Hurst, and republish stuff at will. But certainly in my lifetime, probably in the last century or more, copyright's been very important. It gives you something to sell, basically. And I think that's now under threat, particularly with newspapers on the internet. But something I should explain, because a lot of people have said to me, well, so what? Most people don't get their news from newspapers anyway. Does it matter if newspapers disappeared tomorrow, really? Most people, after all, get their news now from the radio, the television, from websites. I think something that's perhaps not so well known amongst outsiders is that the radio and the television and the internet get most of their news from the newspapers too. Newspapers employ hundreds of people who spend a lot of their time just going out and looking at stuff and not writing it down because it's not very interesting, but they have to have that watching brief and be there for when something interesting occurs. It's an incredibly expensive business. If you took newspapers out of the equation and television stations, radio stations had to start doing all that work themselves, I don't think they could afford it. So if newspapers do disappear, we are going to have, I think, a genuine crisis in the media. So the question is, will newspapers disappear? This is obviously a contentious issue. At the end of the day, I don't know. No one knows. But I did talk to some experts in preparing this speech, people who've been in the media for a long time, and there was more pessimism there than I was aware of about the future. Some of them, for example, have suggested the Australian newspaper could close down when Rupert Murdoch dies. One mentioned that the Sydney Morning Herald about 2 years ago made 1/10 the profit that it had made a decade earlier. Now, I don't want to pick on those publications, I don't want to say that they are predictions, but the situation is certainly fairly dire, and people who know what they're talking about are talking in those terms. And certainly newspapers have already closed in places such as America. It could happen here. The last decade's been very rough. The next decade will not necessarily be any better. Any serving editor you talk to assures you that the situation has now plateaued and everything's going to be all right. But I don't think that's true, and I don't think people with a lot of experience who are standing outside looking in are that optimistic. And what's happened is that the internet has destroyed copyright because most newspapers have gone online. They offer their articles for free. For example, if I write an article for the Sydney Morning Herald, it appears on its website. People can read it for free. The paper would like to charge them, but it doesn't dare to do that because they fear that people will then just simply go somewhere else. And that article will often be downloaded and appear on dozens of other websites where yet more people will view it for free. I was in the Supreme Court of New South Wales the other day where the judge ordered the Sydney Morning Herald to take down a number of articles referring to a particular criminal because a trial was coming up. And the lawyer for Fairfax, who was opposing this, pointed out that if you Googled this person's name, there are something like 8,000 articles out there now, most of them copies of the Herald that have gone out to other places. So this stuff gets out there, it's read by huge numbers of people. And so what we're seeing here, in a sense, is a breakdown of property rights, of intellectual property, at least compared to the way it's been kept under control in the last century or so. Newspapers don't seem to know what to do. I mean, they've gone online in order to remain relevant, and because by going online you can carry over some of your advertising that you lose from the print edition. But it's a small amount. You know, I've often heard figures of less than 10%. So this is not really a solution, and newspapers just don't know what's going to happen. So what could be done? I think one possibility would be simply to renew property right law. I mean, this happens from time to time as new technology arises, new circumstances arise. You know, all the aspects of Western civilization have to be renewed and rejigged from time to time. I suspect at some point maybe the newspapers, who have a certain amount of political power, might be able to persuade the government that there'll need to be some sort of charging system for people who read things online. I don't know how it would work. I've talked to people in the computer industry, they tell me it could work. Maybe it would be internet service providers, no one really knows. But in the absence of this, I think there is a real risk that newspapers could, at least some of us, shut down. No one's talking about this charging system yet, but it's actually not that radical. It's an extension, in a way, of an arrangement that exists already for books and even newspapers. The government actually has something called the Copyright Agency, and whenever a book's borrowed from a library or a book or newspaper is photocopied in a school or even a library, both the publisher and the author receive a small fee these days. And this came in, I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, I'm not sure, but it's just an example of how we can adapt some of our institutions to preserve the things that are important. One last argument in favour of my proposal, I'd suggest that the government to some extent has an obligation to help the private media survive, because one of the reasons newspapers are struggling now is the subsidised competition provided by the government's own media outlet, the ABC. I mean, it's a point of some contention to those of us in the private media, although I work in both, that if you run a butcher shop or a coal mine, the government's not competing with you. But if you run a website now, a news website, there's a competition from the publicly funded ABC. So the ABC doesn't only live off the private press in the sense of relying on newspapers a lot for its news and also for its sense of the agenda and discussion. It also undermines it because it draws away tens of thousands of people who otherwise, presumably, would be using the private websites and thereby boosting their ad revenue, because the number of hits to the private websites of Fairfax and News Limited and other people would go up. Indeed, another possible solution to the problem I've outlined would simply be to close down the ABC, thereby delivering all these new readers to private media websites, but I know that would be unpalatable to the many Australians for whom the ABC is considered one of the glories of Western civilization, and rightly so. But if none of these suggestions is adopted, the failure of property rights that I've described could see at least some newspapers in Australia close, maybe within a decade. The future of serious media in this country would then lie largely with an ABC deprived of the support of those very newspapers on which it now depends. That would be bad for journalists if it were to happen, but it could also be bad for the ABC itself and possibly even for the quality of our politics. So this little corner of Western civilization that we occupy could end up being diminished. Thank you.